My name is Claire and I'm 29 years old. 3 years ago, my mother called me 4 days before Thanksgiving and said 6 words that shattered everything. I thought I knew about family, love, and belonging. We don't have a seat anymore. I remember exactly where I was. I was in my studio, the scent of linseed oil and turpentine hanging heavy in the air. I was working on a commission, a large-scale floral piece. I had been painting a peony, trying to capture that specific, fragile shade of pink that looks like a heartbeat. My hands were stained with pigment. "What do you mean, Mom?" I asked, my voice coming out smaller than I wanted. I tucked the phone between my ear and shoulder, my fingers hovering over the canvas. "Well," Linda said, and I could hear the rhythmic clack, clack, clack of her chopping, vegetables in the background. She was already preparing. She always started early. Victoria and her husband are bringing his parents this year. And then there's the new baby, of course. With the high chair and the diaper bags. There's just no physical room at the table, Claire. We counted the chairs. We're one short. The silence that followed was heavy. It wasn't the silence of a pause. It was the silence of an execution. Through the window of my studio, I watched the gray November rain streak against the glass. "I can bring a folding chair," I said. My heart was thumping against my ribs like a trapped bird. "I have that stool from the studio. I don't mind sitting in the corner, Mom. I just want to be there." "Oh, don't be dramatic," she sighed. And I could practically see her rolling her eyes, the way she did whenever I expressed a need. A folding chair would ruin the flow of the room. "It's a formal dinner, Claire. Let's just be grown-ups about this. You can come over the following weekend for leftovers. We'll do a nice little lunch, just us. Just us, the leftovers of a life." "Does Dad know?" I asked. "Your father agrees we shouldn't be cramped," she said quickly. Too quickly. In the background, I heard my father, David, murmur something. I couldn't make out the words, but I knew the tone. It was the tone of a man who had spent 30 years choosing peace over his youngest daughter. He didn't chime in. He didn't ask to speak to me. He just let the silence happen. "I see," I whispered. My throat felt like it was closing up, thick with the taste of copper and swallowed tears. "Good, I knew you'd understand. You've always been the low-maintenance one. Not like Victoria. Honestly, with the baby, she's a nervous wreck. We have to make things perfect for her right now. Anyway, I have to go. The stuffing won't make itself." The line went dead. I stood there for a long time, the dial tone buzzing in my ear until it turned into that shrill, rhythmic beep. I didn't move. I didn't cry, not yet. I just looked at the peony on my canvas. It was beautiful, but it was disconnected. A flower without a stem, floating in a sea of white gesso. I looked around my studio. It was my sanctuary, the place where I turned my pain into something people wanted to hang on their walls. But in that moment, the walls felt like they were leaning in. I was 29 years old, and I had just been RSVP'd out of my own family. It wasn't just about a chair. It was never about the chair. It was about the 29 years of being the low-maintenance one. The one who got the hand-me-down clothes that didn't fit because Victoria needed the new designer coat. The one whose gallery openings were missed because Victoria had a minor cold. The one who was expected to understand, to pivot, to shrink, so that everyone else could take up more space. I walked over to the sink to wash my hands. The water was ice cold. I scrubbed at the pink paint under my fingernails, but it wouldn't come out. It looked like blood. I thought about the year before. I had spent 3 days helping my mother prep that dinner. I had polished the silver until my wrists ached. I had hauled the heavy folding tables out of the basement. I had spent the entire dinner running back and forth to the kitchen, making sure Victoria's wine glass was never empty and the baby didn't drop his toy. I had been the ghost at the feast, and apparently, the ghost was no longer required. I walked into my small kitchen and opened the fridge. A carton of eggs, a half-empty bottle of soy sauce, and a single wilting bunch of kale. I had cleared my schedule for the holiday. I hadn't bought groceries. I had assumed I would be home. The word home felt like a bruise. I sat down at my small wooden table, a thrift store. Fine that I'd sanded and stained myself. It only had 2 chairs. One for me and one for a guest who rarely came. I picked up my phone again. My thumb hovered over Victoria's name in my contacts. I wanted to scream at her. I wanted to ask her how she could let this happen. How she could sit there eating turkey and laughing, knowing her sister was sitting in a dark apartment 40 miles away because her husband's parents needed her spot. But I knew what she would say. "Oh, Claire, don't make this about you. You know how stressed I am. Why do you always have to cause drama? If you ask for a seat, you're causing drama. If you stay silent, you're invisible. I put the phone down on the table, screen side down. The rain turned to sleet, tapping against the window pane with a metallic clicking sound. The apartment felt colder than it had 10 minutes ago. I went to the closet and pulled out my heaviest cardigan, wrapping it around myself until I was a bundle of wool and resentment. I thought about the secret my mother had always kept, the one she didn't even know she was telling. The secret was that love was a finite resource in our house. There was only so much to go around, and the pitcher always ran dry before it reached my glass. I looked at the clock. It was 5:15 p.m. somewhere. People were finishing their workdays, heading home to plan menus, arguing about who was bringing the cranberry sauce, laughing about burnt pies. I was just here. Something inside me went quiet. Not sad, not angry, just empty. It was a strange, hollow feeling, like a house that had been cleared of all its furniture. I felt light, almost as if I could float away if I didn't hold on to the edge of the table. But as the darkness settled in, something else settled too. A quiet decision I didn't even fully understand yet. If there was no room for me at their table, I would stop trying to pull up a chair. I would stop bringing my own stool. I would stop polishing their silver. I didn't know where I was going to go, or who I was going to be without the identity of the low-maintenance daughter, but I knew one thing. I wasn't going to show up for the leftovers. The decision to decline the leftover lunch felt like pulling a single thread on a cheap sweater. I expected a small gap. I didn't expect the whole thing to unravel. Growing up, the architecture of our family was built on a very specific hierarchy. Victoria was the masterpiece, the golden child whose every milestone was treated like a national holiday. I was the background, the beige wall intended to make the masterpiece pop. I remember my 10th birthday. I had asked for a set of real acrylic paints, the kind in the heavy tubes that smelled like possibility. I had spent months pointing them out in the window of the local craft shop. When the day came, I tore open the wrapping paper to find a sweater. It was a beautiful hand-knit wool sweater in a deep navy blue. "It's so you can be warm while you watch Victoria's soccer games," my mother had said, her eyes bright with her own perceived thoughtfulness. "It gets so chilly on those bleachers, and we're going to be there every weekend this season." I looked at the navy wool and felt a strange, cold weight in my stomach. Even my birthday was an investment in someone else's journey. I looked at my father, hoping for a, "We'll get the paints next week, kiddo?" But he just adjusted his glasses and nodded. "Practical," he'd said. "Very practical, Claire." That was the word for me. Practical. Low maintenance, sturdy, the kind of daughter you could leave in a room and trust she wouldn't set anything on fire or demand too much oxygen. As I sat in my silent apartment 2 days after the no-seat phone call, those memories started playing like a grainy film strip. I saw myself at 14, sitting in the back of the car, while the three of them discussed Victoria's prom dress for 45 minutes, only to be told we didn't have time to stop at the library for the books I needed for my art history paper. I saw myself at 22, graduating cum laude from art school. My parents arrived late because Victoria's morning sickness with her first pregnancy had been an absolute crisis. They missed my walk across the stage. At the celebratory dinner, the conversation revolved entirely around nursery themes and pediatricians. I had placed my diploma on the empty chair next to me. It felt like the only guest I'd actually invited. The smell of my apartment, stale coffee, and the sharp, metallic scent of drying oil paint felt like a reproach. I had built this life around their crumbs. I had moved to this city to be close enough to help, but far enough not to be a burden. I realized then that I had been complicit. I had accepted the role of the backup player. I had played the part of the girl who didn't mind the folding chair so well that they eventually decided I didn't even need that. The phone buzzed on the coffee table. A text from Victoria. "Hey, Mom mentioned you can't make it Thursday. Bummer, but honestly, it's for the best. The house is going to be a zoo with the in-laws and the baby's new nap schedule. Can you Venmo me for Mom's birthday gift? I bought that designer vase she wanted. Your share is $150. I stared at the screen. The audacity was almost impressive. I wasn't invited to the meal, but I was still expected to subsidize the centerpiece. I didn't reply. I watched the little typing bubbles appear and disappear. She was waiting for the "sure, no problem" that usually came within seconds. When it didn't arrive, she sent a question mark. I deleted the thread. I stood up and walked to the long mirror in my hallway. I looked at my face, the smudge of charcoal on my cheek, the tired lines around my eyes. I looked like a woman who was tired of apologizing for taking up space. I went to my studio and picked up a palette knife. I didn't want to paint peonies anymore. I didn't want to paint things that were soft and fragile and easily crushed. I scraped a glob of deep, bruised purple onto the blade and smeared it across the white canvas. It was a violent, beautiful mark. My mother called that evening. I let it ring. My father called an hour later. I let it ring. The silence in my apartment began to feel less like loneliness and more like a fortress. But even fortresses have cracks. As the night deepened and the wind rattled my windows, I felt the familiar nagging ache of the good daughter guilt. It told me I was being petty. It told me I was overreacting. It told me that family is family and you just endure. I thought about my father. I missed him in a way. I missed the man I imagined he could be if he ever stood up. I remembered him tucking me in when I was 6, whispering that I was his quiet star. But stars are millions of miles away, I thought now. Maybe that's why he liked the metaphor. I was easy to admire from a distance where he didn't have to do the work of protecting me. I went to the kitchen and made a cup of tea. The heat of the mug felt good against my palms, which were still stained with the colors of my work. I thought about the secret in the title of this story, the secret my mother-in-law, who I hadn't even met yet, would eventually uncover. It was a secret that was already rotting in the foundations of our family tree, a lie about blood and loyalty that they all believed, but I was starting to see through. I realized I had spent my life waiting for a permission slip to be angry. I was waiting for them to do something so monstrous that my departure would be justified in their eyes. But they weren't monsters. They were just people who didn't care enough to make room. And somehow that felt worse. I sat in my apartment as the sun went down, watching the shadows stretch across my floor. My father had a chance to choose me. He had a chance to say, if Claire isn't there, I'm not sitting down. And he chose silence instead. I took a sip of the bitter tea and looked at my suitcases in the top of the closet. Thanksgiving was in 3 days. I had no seat at the table. I had no plans. And for the first time in my life, I had no intention of being low maintenance. The decision was forming, sharp and cold as an icicle. If I wasn't part of the family, I didn't have to follow the rules. The morning of Thanksgiving arrived with a sky the color of a wet sidewalk. The city was unnervingly quiet, a muffled stillness that happens only when everyone has somewhere to be and you have nowhere. I woke up to a flurry of group texts. Photos of the kids' table set with miniature pumpkins. Photos of Victoria's husband, Mark, carving a turkey that looked large enough to feed a small village. My mother had posted a photo of the main table, the adult table, set with the good china, and the silver I had polished last year. There were 12 chairs. 12. I counted them twice, zooming in until the pixels blurred. My mother had said they were 1 short, but there, between my father and the empty space for the gravy boat, was a gap that could have easily fit a 13th chair. A folding chair. A stool, a milk crate. They hadn't run out of room. They had run out of desire. I sat on the edge of my bed, the cold air from the window seeping through my pajamas. The smell of the apartment was stagnant, just old paint and the faint, dusty scent of the radiator. Usually on this day, I would be smelling the trinity of Thanksgiving: sage, roasted onions, and my mother's heavy floral perfume. Instead, I smelled nothing. I walked to the kitchen and opened the cupboard. A box of generic cereal and a single lonely orange. I tried to peel the orange, but my hands were shaking so hard the zest sprayed into my eye. I winced, the sting sharp and immediate. I dropped the fruit on the counter and finally, for the first time since the phone call, I let out a jagged, broken sob. It wasn't a cinematic cry. It was ugly. It was the sound of a 29-year-old woman realizing she was an orphan with living parents. I hit rock bottom at 2 p.m. I found myself sitting on the floor of my shower, the water running cold because the water heater had given up, much like I had. I was wearing my navy blue soccer bleacher sweater because I was shivering, and the wool felt heavy and sodden against my skin. I am a ghost, I thought. I've been dead to them for years, and I'm just now noticing the funeral. The silence of the apartment was a physical weight. It felt like it was pressing the air out of my lungs. Every ping of my phone was a new knife, another photo of a smiling family I wasn't allowed to belong to. I stood up, the wet sweater dripping onto the bath mat. I looked at myself in the fogged-up mirror. My eyes were bloodshot, my hair a tangled mess. I looked like a woman who had been discarded. No, I whispered to the empty room. I wasn't going to spend this day mourning people who were currently laughing over yams. I wasn't going to be the tragedy in their story. I stripped off the wet clothes, dried my hair until it was a wild, dark halo, and put on my favorite velvet dress, the deep emerald one, I'd bought for a gallery opening that my parents never attended. I put on red lipstick, the kind that feels like armor. I looked at my reflection. I looked fierce, even if I felt hollow. I grabbed my coat and my purse. If I was going to eat Thanksgiving dinner alone, I was going to do it somewhere with actual food, with light, with life. I just had to find a restaurant that was still open. I walked out of my apartment and slammed the door. I didn't look back. The streets were deserted. The wind whipped the remaining autumn leaves into tiny tornadoes on the corners. I walked for 6 blocks, my heels clicking rhythmically on the pavement, the only sound in the neighborhood. Every bistro was dark. Every cafe had a closed for holiday sign mocking me from the window. I felt the panic rising again. Was I going to end up at a gas station eating a prepackaged sandwich? Was that the climax of my humiliation? I turned a corner and saw a faint golden glow at the end of the block. It was a small neighborhood diner called the Silver Spoon. It was the kind of place with vinyl booths and a jukebox that still played 45s. The open sign was flickering, a neon heartbeat in the gray afternoon. As I approached, the scent hit me first. Not the sterile, organized smell of my mother's kitchen, but something deep and soulful. Yeast, slow-cooked beef, cinnamon, the smell of a place that didn't care about flow or formal settings. I pushed the door open. A bell jingled, a bright silver sound. The warmth hit me like a physical embrace. The diner was packed, but not with families. It was filled with the others, a group of elderly men in veteran caps. 2 students with textbooks open next to their plates. A nurse in her scrubs looking exhausted but content. And then I saw her. An older woman with a crown of silver hair and a bright yellow apron was standing behind the counter, laughing as she poured coffee for a man who looked like he hadn't had a home in a long time. She looked up and saw me standing there in my emerald velvet dress and my red lipstick, looking like a lost queen in a shipwreck. She didn't look at my tear-stained face with pity. She looked at me with a sharp, knowing clarity. "Well, look at you," she said, her voice like warm honey and gravel. "You look like you're dressed for a party that hasn't started yet." I opened my mouth to speak, but my voice failed me. I just stood there clutching my purse. "Don't you worry, sugar," she said, wiping her hands on her apron and walking around the counter. She didn't ask if I had a reservation. She didn't ask why I was alone. She just took my arm. "We've been waiting for you. We've got 1 seat left." She led me to a small booth in the back, right under a window that looked out onto the street. "I'm Margaret," she said, pulling out the chair. "And you look like you need the biggest slice of pumpkin pie this city has ever seen. But first, turkey?" I sat down. The vinyl of the booth was warm. For the first time in 29 years, I didn't feel like I was taking up too much space. I felt like the space had been carved out specifically for me. I grabbed my coat. If I was going to eat Thanksgiving dinner alone, I was going to do it somewhere with actual food, with light, with life. I just had to find a restaurant that was still open. The diner felt like a different world, a pocket of warmth stitched into the cold, gray fabric of the city. Margaret didn't wait for me to order. She returned minutes later with a heavy ceramic mug of coffee and a small plate of cornbread, the butter still melting into the golden crumbs. "Eat," she said, a gentle command. "The turkey is resting. It'll be out in 10. I took a bite of the cornbread. It was sweet, salty, and warm, the first thing I'd eaten all day. It tasted like a rescue. As I sat there, the door jingled again. A tall, broad-shouldered man walked in, shaking a damp umbrella. He had dark, messy hair and a scarf tucked into a rugged wool coat. He looked exhausted, the kind of tired that comes from a long shift, but his eyes lit up when he saw Margaret. "Hey, Ma," he said, leaning over the counter to kiss her cheek. "You're late, Marcus," Margaret teased, though she was already plating a mountain of mashed potatoes. "Sit anywhere there's a gap." Marcus scanned the room. The diner was full, the hum of low conversation and the clinking of silverware creating a rhythmic, domestic symphony. His eyes landed on me. I realized then how I must have looked, emerald velvet and red lipstick in a sea of flannel and denim. I felt a flush of my old self-consciousness, the low-maintenance girl wanting to vanish. Mind if I take the other side? He asked, gesturing to the booth. Everywhere else is a squeeze. Oh, no, please, I said, sliding closer to the window. He slid in, bringing with him the scent of rain, cedarwood, and something crisp, like fresh air. He caught sight of my coffee-stained napkin and the way I was clutching my mug like a lifeline. He didn't look away or make a joke. He just extended a hand. I'm Marcus. I'm the local forced labor for the holiday shift, he joked, nodding toward Margaret. But the food's worth the price of admission. I'm Claire, I whispered. Nice to meet you, Claire. You look like you've had a day. He didn't say it as a question. It was an observation, delivered with a kindness that felt like a soft blanket. I was supposed to be somewhere else, I said, the honesty bubbling up before I could stop it. But the table was full. Marcus paused, his hand halfway to the sugar shaker. He looked at me, really looked at me. Their loss, he said firmly. My mother always says if the table is full, you just build a bigger table. Anyone who tells you otherwise isn't worth the appetite. At that moment, Margaret arrived with 2 massive plates. Turkey, stuffing, roasted root vegetables, and a cranberry sauce that looked like melted rubies. She set one in front of me and one in front of Marcus. Now, Margaret said, resting a hand on my shoulder. No more talk of supposed to be. You are here. You are fed. And in this house, that makes you family for the next hour. I looked at the plate, then up at this woman I'd known for 20 minutes. The weight in my chest, that heavy, leaden feeling of being discarded, began to shift. It didn't disappear. Grief doesn't work that way, but it felt less like a cage and more like a heavy coat. I could finally unbutton. Marcus started talking. He didn't ask me invasive questions. He told me about his work as a carpenter, about the way wood has a memory, and how you have to respect the grain if you want the piece to last. He spoke with a quiet passion that reminded me of how I felt about my paintings. For the first time in my life, I wasn't being talked at. I wasn't waiting for a gap in a conversation about Victoria's life. I was being seen. You're an artist, he said suddenly, looking at my hands. I hadn't realized I'd been fidgeting with a stray thread on my sleeve, but the faint stains of cobalt, blue and madder root were still visible around my cuticles. I am, I said, a little surprised. A painter. Mostly florals and abstracts. Makes sense, he smiled. You have the eyes for it. You look at things like you're trying to find the light source. The evening blurred into a hazy golden glow. The diner grew quieter as the sun went down completely. The old veterans left with boxes of leftovers. The students packed up their books. But Marcus and I stayed, joined eventually by Margaret and an older man named Richard, Marcus's father, who had been in the back kitchen doing the heavy lifting. Richard was a steady, quiet man with hands that looked like they could build a cathedral or hold a sparrow without crushing it. He sat down with a sigh of satisfaction, placing a hand over Margaret's. Who's this? He asked, nodding to me with a warm smile. This is Claire, Margaret said, her voice full of pride as if she'd discovered a rare gem. She's an artist, Richard, and she's staying for pie. Richard looked at me with the same steady gaze as his son. Well, Claire, welcome to the chaos. It's not much, but the company is honest. I looked at the 3 of them, a family. A real functioning, messy, beautiful family that saw a stranger in a green dress and didn't see a burden or a 13th chair. They saw a person. I felt a hum in my pocket, my phone. I pulled it out. A text from my mother. The dinner was a huge success. Everyone missed you, of course. Victoria's mother-in-law brought her own special chair, so it's a good thing you didn't come. We really would have been on top of each other. See you Saturday for lunch? I looked at the screen. I looked at the words everyone missed you. It was a lie. If they missed me, they would have called. If they missed me, my father would have driven the 40 miles to pick me up. I looked at Marcus, who was currently arguing with his father about the best way to sand cherry wood. I looked at Margaret, who was humming a jazz tune while she sliced a pumpkin pie. I didn't feel the sting this time. I felt a strange, cold clarity. My mother thought she was offering me a seat at a table that was already empty. Everything okay? Marcus asked, noticing my gaze linger on the phone. I looked at him, then back at the message. I didn't type a long, angry paragraph. I didn't cry. I simply blocked the number. Then I blocked Victoria. Then I blocked my father. I put the phone back in my purse. Everything is perfect, I said. And for the first time in my life, I meant it. Good, Margaret said, sliding a massive slice of pie in front of me, topped with a mountain of whipped cream. because the best part of the meal is just beginning. I took a bite. It was sweet, spiced, and rich. I looked out the window at the dark, rainy street. The girl who had walked into this diner an hour ago was gone. She had been replaced by someone who was starting to realize that sometimes you have to lose your place at one table to find where you truly belong. The weeks following Thanksgiving were a blur of transition, a slow thawing of a winter I had lived in for nearly 3 decades. I didn't go to the leftover lunch. I didn't answer the door when my father eventually drove down to my apartment, his silhouette visible through the peephole as he stood there holding a Tupperware container like a peace offering. I watched him through the fisheye lens until he sighed, left the plastic bowl on the mat, and walked away. The Tupperware sat there for 3 days. I never opened it. I didn't want the remnants of a life that no longer fit. Instead, I found myself drawn back to the silver spoon. It started with a thank you card. I painted for Margaret, a small watercolor of the diner's storefront, the neon sign glowing against a purple twilight. When I dropped it off, she didn't just thank me. She pulled me into the kitchen and taught me how to make her signature yeast rolls. "The secret is the patience, Claire," Margaret said, her hands dusted with flour as she punched down the dough. "You can't rush the rise. If you try to force it before it's ready, the bread comes out heavy. You have to give it the right environment to grow." I realized she wasn't just talking about the bread. Over the next few months, my life began to reorganize itself around the warmth of Margaret and Richard's world. They became my Saturday morning. I would bring my sketchbook to the diner, sitting in the back booth while Marcus worked on the various repairs the old building constantly demanded. He was always there, a steady presence of flannel and sawdust. He started coming by my studio, too. He didn't just look at my paintings. He looked at the way I painted. "You're holding your breath," he said one afternoon, standing behind me as I worked on a large abstract piece. I stopped, my brush hovering inches from the canvas. I hadn't even realized it. "I don't want to mess it up," I whispered. Marcus stepped closer, the familiar scent of cedar and rain enveloping me. "It's your world, Claire. You can't mess up something you're creating from scratch. If you don't like a stroke, you paint over it. That's the beauty of it. You're the one who decides what stays." He reached out, his rough, calloused hand gently covering mine on the brush handle. He guided my hand in a long, sweeping motion across the canvas, breaking the tight, controlled pattern I'd been stuck in. "There," he breathed. "Let it breathe." I felt a shiver that had nothing to do with the drafty studio. For the first time, I felt safe enough to be imperfect. With my biological family, every move had to be calculated to avoid being a burden. With Marcus, and with Margaret and Richard, I was allowed to be a work in progress. One Sunday, Margaret invited me to their home for dinner. Not the diner, but their actual house, a craftsman bungalow, filled with mismatched furniture and the smell of old books and dried lavender. As I walked in, I saw a hallway lined with photographs. There were pictures of Marcus as a muddy toddler, Richard in his younger days at a wood shop, and Margaret laughing at a summer picnic. And then my heart stopped. There, tucked between a photo of Marcus's graduation and a landscape of the coast, was the watercolor I had painted for Margaret. It wasn't just displayed. It was framed in a beautiful, hand-carved cherry wood frame that I knew Marcus must have made. "It belongs there," Richard said, appearing behind me with 2 glasses of iced tea. "It's a part of the story now." I felt a lump form in my throat. This wasn't a folding chair situation. They didn't have to move anything to make room for me. They simply opened the circle and let me in. Throughout the dinner, the conversation was easy. We talked about art, about the furniture Marcus was building, about Margaret's dream of opening a small bakery next to the diner. There was no golden child to cater to. There were no hidden agendas. But as the night wound down, Margaret sat me down on the porch swing. The air was crisp, the first hints of spring beginning to tease the garden. "Claire," she said softly, her eyes searching mine, "I know you've been hurt. I can see it in the way you wait for permission to speak, the way you apologize for just existing." I looked down at my hands, embarrassed. "You don't have to do that here," she continued, taking my hand in hers. "We didn't bring you in because we felt sorry for you. We brought you in because we like the light you bring into the room. You're not a guest anymore, honey. You're ours if you want to be." I looked at the house behind her, the golden light spilling out of the windows. I thought about my mother's perfect table and the 12 chairs that were actually 11. I thought about the years I spent shrinking. "I want to be," I whispered. The healing didn't happen overnight. There were still nights when I would wake up with a start, the echo of my mother's dismissive voice ringing in my ears. There were moments when I'd see a family in a park and feel a sharp, stabbing pang of what I'd lost. But then I would go to the diner. I would see Marcus's easy grin or feel Richard's steady hand on my shoulder. I would help Margaret prep the morning pies, our shoulders brushing in the small kitchen. I was learning that trust isn't a single event. It's a series of small, consistent moments. It's the way Marcus always remembered how I liked my coffee. It's the way Richard asked my opinion on the wood grain for a new table. It's the way Margaret called me just to say she'd seen a flower that reminded her of my paintings. I was being woven into a new tapestry, one made of stronger thread. One evening, Marcus took me to a hilltop overlooking the city. The lights twinkled like fallen stars. "I've been thinking," he said, his voice low and steady. "About wood grain?" I teased. "About us," he said, turning to face me. "About how I can't imagine that back booth without you in it. About how I want to be the person who makes sure you always have a seat, no matter where we go." He didn't pull out a ring, not yet. He just pulled me into his arms, and for the first time in my life, I didn't feel like I was taking up too much space. I felt like I was exactly the right size. As I leaned against him, watching the city glow, I realized that the secret my mother-in-law would eventually uncover wasn't just a piece of paper or a DNA result. The real secret was that family is something you build, not something you're born into. And we were just getting started on the foundation. The year that followed felt like a slow-motion sunrise. For the first time in my life, I wasn't bracing for a storm. I was learning to live in the light. My relationship with Marcus blossomed with a natural, grounded intensity. It wasn't the frantic, desperate love I had seen in my sister's marriage, a constant performance of perfection to keep my mother's approval. With Marcus, it was quiet. It was Sunday mornings with the smell of strong coffee and sawdust. It was the way he looked at my sketches not as hobbies, but as a vital part of who I was. "You're using more yellow lately," he remarked one evening in my studio. He was installing a custom-built rack for my larger canvases, his way of making my space more efficient. I looked at the piece on the easel. He was right. The bruised purples and cold grays of the previous winter were gone. In their place were warm ochres, buttery creams, and a vibrant, defiant gold. "I feel lighter," I admitted, leaning my head against his shoulder. "Like I'm not waiting for the other shoe to drop." "There is no other shoe, Claire," he said, kissing the top of my head. "Just us. And maybe some flooring I need to finish for a client. But that's it." As my bond with Marcus deepened, so did my place in the heart of his family. Margaret and Richard didn't just accept me, they claimed me. Margaret started introducing me as her other daughter at the diner, and Richard began teaching me the basics of wood turning, his patience a stark contrast to my father's lifelong silence. One afternoon, while helping Margaret reorganize her pantry, I stumbled upon a stack of old photo albums. We sat on the kitchen floor, the air smelling of cinnamon and floor wax. She showed me pictures of Marcus as a gangly teenager and Richard with a full head of dark hair. "I always wanted a daughter," Margaret said softly, tracing a photo of a much younger version of herself. "Someone to share the recipes with, someone to keep these boys in line." She looked at me, her gaze steady and warm. "I'm glad it turned out to be you." "Even with my history?" I asked, the old insecurity flickering for a moment. "Even with the mess I left behind?" Margaret closed the album and took my hands in hers. Her palms were dry and lined with the history of 1,000 meals served. "Claire, listen to me. Your history is just the road that brought you to our door. We don't judge the traveler by the mud on their boots. We judge them by how they treat the home they enter. And you, honey, you've made this home brighter." It was the first time I felt truly safe, not just loved, but protected. But the peace was punctured a few weeks later. I was at the diner, helping Richard fix a leaking pipe behind the counter, when my phone buzzed on the laminate surface. It was a restricted number. Against my better judgment, I answered, "Claire, is that you?" It was Victoria. Her voice was sharp, brittle, and layered with that familiar tone of aggrieved entitlement. "Victoria," I said, my heart rate spiking. Richard looked up from the pipe, sensing the shift in my energy. He didn't say anything, but he stayed close. "Where have you been?" she demanded. "Mom and Dad have been frantic." "You blocked everyone!" "Do you have any idea how selfish that is? Mom's been crying for weeks because you missed Christmas and then Easter. She had a whole brunch planned. I didn't miss them, Victoria, I said, my voice surprisingly steady. I just wasn't there. Whatever. Look, I'm calling because Mom is starting to get suspicious. She thinks you're in trouble, and honestly, the drama is exhausting. Just call her, apologize for the tantrum, and come over this Sunday. We're having a gender reveal for the new baby, and Mom wants the whole family there for the photos. The whole family, the words felt like a slap. I can't make it, I said. What do you mean you can't? What could you possibly be doing that's more important than your sister's baby? I looked at Richard, who was watching me with a quiet, supportive intensity. I looked at the open sign flickering in the window. I looked at the flower on my apron. I'm with my family, Victoria, I said clearly. The one that made a seat for me. What are you talking about? You don't have another family. Don't be insane. If you don't show up, Dad says he's going to stop by your apartment again. And this time he's not leaving until you talk. He can try, I said. But I won't be there. Goodbye, Victoria. I hung up and turned the phone off. My hands were trembling, but not with fear. It was the adrenaline of finally saying no. Richard stood up, wiping his hands on a rag. You okay, kid? I think so, I said, taking a shaky breath. They don't understand. They think I'm just being difficult. People who benefit from your silence will always call your voice drama, Richard said, his voice a low rumble of wisdom. You're doing fine. Let them talk to the wind? That night, Marcus took me to dinner, a real date at a quiet Italian place where the candles were low and the wine was red. We talked about the future. Not the maybe future, but the when future. I want you to meet some of my extended family, Marcus said, taking my hand across the table. My aunt, my cousins, and my grandmother. She's the matriarch. She's a bit of a force of nature, but she'll love you. I'd like that, I said. As we walked back to his truck, the night air was sweet with the scent of blooming jasmine. I felt a sense of joy I hadn't known was possible, a joy that wasn't tied to an achievement or a low-maintenance behavior. I was just happy because I was me, and that was enough. But as we pulled into his driveway, I saw a car parked at the curb. A familiar car? A silver sedan that belonged to my father. My heart plummeted. Is that them? Marcus asked, his voice instantly dropping an octave, becoming protective. It's my dad, I whispered. I got out of the truck, my legs feeling like lead. My father stepped out of the car, looking older, more tired, but still carrying that aura of passive disappointment. Claire, he said, stepping into the light of the street lamp. We've been looking everywhere for you. Your mother is a wreck. I told Victoria I wasn't coming, Dad. You can't just cut us off, Claire. We're blood. That means something. Whatever little spat you had with your mother over Thanksgiving, it's over. It's time to come home. I looked at Marcus, who was standing by the truck, his presence a silent wall of support. Then I looked at my father. Dad, I said, my voice cracking but holding. You didn't fight for me to have a seat at that table. You didn't even call me that day to see if I was okay. You stayed silent. And in this family, silence is a choice. I was trying to keep the peace, he snapped, a flash of his own frustration surfacing. You kept your peace at the expense of mine, I replied. I'm not coming back to be the backup daughter. I found people who choose me first. Please, just leave. My father looked at Marcus, then back at me. He looked like he wanted to say something. Perhaps an apology. Perhaps another excuse, but the habits of 30 years were too strong. He just shook his head, got back into his car, and drove away. As the taillights disappeared, Marcus wrapped his arms around me from behind. I leaned back into his strength, watching the empty street. I was sad, yes, but I was also free. The bond was permanent now. Not because of blood, but because of choice. The months that followed were defined by a different kind of building. It wasn't just the furniture Marcus was crafting in his shop, or the canvases I was filling with light. We were building a foundation that didn't rely on the shaky ground of my past. By the time the leaves began to turn gold again, Marcus had asked me to be his wife. There was no grand spectacle, no viral video. It happened in the quiet of my studio, amidst the scent of linseed oil and the soft hum of the city outside. He had built a small, intricate wooden box, and inside was a ring that looked like a crown of woven vines. I don't just want to be your husband, Claire, he had said, his voice thick with an uncharacteristic tremor. I want to be the person who makes sure you never have to wonder if there's a seat for you. Because from now on, the table is ours. I said yes before he could even finish the sentence. But as the wedding planning began, a strange, hollow ache settled in my chest. It wasn't that I wanted my biological family there. The thought of my mother critiquing the flowers or Victoria making the day about her pregnancy made my skin crawl. It was the legal reality of it. On every form under mother and father, those names still sat like ghosts. Linda and David, the people who shared my DNA but none of my life. One evening, Margaret found me staring at a marriage license application in the diner's back office. I was crying, though I hadn't realized the tears were falling until a drop hit the paper. "What is it, honey?" she asked, pulling up a chair, always a chair beside me. "I'm getting married," I whispered, "and I've never felt more like an orphan. I look at these lines for parents, and I don't want to write their names. It feels like a lie. They didn't make me the woman Marcus loves." "You did, Richard did." Margaret was silent for a long moment. She reached out and tucked a strand of hair behind my ear, her eyes shimmering with a sudden, fierce light. "You know," she said, her voice low and conspiratorial. "There's a way to fix that. It isn't just for children, Claire." "What do you mean?" "Adult adoption," Margaret said. "Richard and I talked about it months ago, but we didn't want to push. We didn't want you to feel like we were trying to replace what you lost. But the truth is, in our hearts, that space is already filled by you. We'd be honored to make it official, if you'll have us." I felt the air leave my lungs. To be chosen, not as a backup, not as an afterthought, but as a deliberate legal act of love. The process was surprisingly simple and deeply profound. On a Tuesday morning in early October, we stood in a small courthouse. Richard wore his best suit, smelling of cedar and peppermint. Margaret was in a soft lavender dress, clutching a lace handkerchief. Marcus stood behind me, his hand resting firmly on the small of my back. When the judge signed the papers, he looked at me and smiled. "Congratulations, Claire. It's not often I get to preside over a family choosing each other with such certainty." I walked out of that courthouse not as Claire, old surname, but as Claire, new surname. I was legally, permanently, undeniably theirs. The wedding planning took on a new energy. We decided on a small ceremony in the garden of Margaret and Richard's bungalow. I wanted it to feel like a homecoming. I designed the invitations myself, hand-painted peonies and oak leaves. I didn't send an invitation to my biological family. I knew it would be the final severing of the cord, and for the first time, I was ready for the silence that would follow. But 3 weeks before the wedding, I received a package in the mail. No return address, just a lumpy manila envelope. Inside was a stack of old medical records and a handwritten note from an aunt I hadn't spoken to in years, my father's sister, the black sheep, who had been cast out for marrying someone my mother didn't approve of. The note was short. "I heard you're making things official with a new family. Good for you. Before you start your new life, you should know the truth about the one you're leaving. Your mother was so obsessed with perfection because she was terrified of her own shadow. Look at the blood types, Claire. Look at the dates." I sat on my floor, the papers spread out around me like a deck of cards. I saw my birth certificate. I saw my mother's blood type. I saw my father's, and then I saw mine. I'm an artist, not a scientist, but I know the basics. It was impossible. The man who had sat in silence for 29 years while I was pushed to the edges of the family, the man I had spent my life trying to earn a crumb of affection from, wasn't my biological father. And my mother, the woman who preached about blood and loyalty and family first, had been sitting on a secret that would have leveled her precious reputation decades ago. She had shamed me for being too much and too sensitive, while she lived a lie that required my absolute compliance to maintain. I realized then why I was always the low-maintenance one. I was the living evidence of a mistake she wanted to forget. I wasn't just a daughter. I was a secret she was trying to bury under the weight of Victoria's perfection. I didn't feel devastated. I felt vindicated. I called Marcus into the room. I showed him the papers. He read them in silence, his jaw tightening as he reached the end. "What do you want to do?" he asked, his voice steady. "We can call them. We can demand answers." I looked at the framed photo of my adoption day on the mantel. I looked at the man who had just legally become my father, Richard, who had never shared my DNA but had shared his home, his heart, and his protection without a second thought. "No," I said, a cold, calm power rising in my chest. "I don't want answers. I already have the only answer that matters. I know who I am now. But I also knew that the biological family, the perfect One wouldn't be able to stay away from the wedding. They would see it as a challenge to their control. The stage was set for a confrontation I hadn't asked for, but one I was finally ready to win. The day of the wedding was a masterpiece of light and shadow. The garden was a sea of emerald green and gold, with white peonies, my favorite, blooming in every corner. The air smelled of damp earth, fresh-cut cedar from the benches Marcus had built, and the buttery scent of the rolls Margaret was baking in the kitchen. I stood in front of the mirror in Margaret's bedroom, wearing a gown of ivory silk. I looked like myself, not a version of me edited for someone else's approval, but a woman who knew her worth. "You look breathtaking, Claire," Margaret whispered, stepping into the room. She reached out and smoothed the lace on my shoulder. Her eyes were bright with tears. "Are you ready?" "I am," I said. And I was. The ceremony was brief and beautiful. When Richard walked me down the aisle of the home that had actually welcomed me, I didn't look at the ground. I looked straight at Marcus, who stood waiting with a look of such fierce, unwavering devotion that it made the past 29 years feel like a distant, bad dream. But just as we were about to exchange vows, the iron gate at the edge of the garden creaked open. The hum of the guests died down instantly. I didn't have to turn around to know who it was. The air seemed to grow colder, thinner. "I told you she wouldn't have the nerve to actually go through with this without us." My mother's voice rang out sharp and high, cutting through the peace like a blade. I turned slowly. Linda was there, dressed in an over-the-top floral suit, flanked by David and a heavily pregnant Victoria. They looked like a trio of mourners at a festival. "Claire!" Linda cried, her face twisted into a mask of maternal concern that didn't reach her eyes. "What is this? An adoption? A wedding we weren't invited to? Have you lost your mind? You're an old surname. You belong to us." The guests were silent. Richard stepped forward, his hand resting on the hilt of his cane, his posture steady and protective. But I put a hand on his arm. This wasn't his battle. I stepped down from the small wooden dais. I walked toward them until I was only a few feet away. "You're right, Mom," I said, my voice calm, almost conversational. "I did belong to you. I belonged to the folding chairs and the leftovers. I belonged to the silence you used to keep me in my place." "Don't be dramatic, Claire," Victoria snapped, leaning on her husband. "You've made your point. You're upset about Thanksgiving. We get it, but this is an embarrassment to the family." I looked at Victoria, then at David. David wouldn't meet my eyes. He looked at the grass, his shoulders hunched. "Which family, Victoria?" I asked. I pulled a small, folded piece of paper from the pocket of my dress, the medical records. "The family built on the truth? Or the one built on the secret Mom's been keeping since before I was born?" The color drained from Linda's face so quickly it was as if a plug had been pulled. She lunged for the paper, but I held it back. "I know, Mom," I said softly. "I know about the blood types. I know David isn't my father. I know I was the mistake. You spent 30 years trying to make invisible so you wouldn't have to look at your own reflection." The silence that followed was absolute. David looked up then, his eyes wide and fractured. He looked at Linda, and for the first time in his life, the silence wasn't passive. It was horrified. "Linda?" he whispered. "It doesn't matter," Linda shrieked, her composure finally shattering. "I raised her. I gave her everything. And this is the thanks I get. Choosing these strangers over us? They aren't strangers, Linda," I said, using her name for the first time. I looked back at Margaret, Richard, and Marcus. "They are the people who saw me when you chose to look away. They are the people who made a seat for me when you said the table was full." I took a step closer to her, my voice dropping to a whisper that only she could hear. "You spent my whole life making me feel like I was lucky to have a place at your table. But today I realized the truth. You weren't the one letting me in. I was the one allowing you to stay in my life. And that ends now." I turned to the gate. "Please leave. You weren't invited and you aren't wanted. There is no seat for you here." For a moment I thought she would scream. I thought she would make a scene that would ruin the day. But she looked around at the faces of the guests, people who saw her not as the perfect mother, but as a woman who had just been exposed. She turned on her heel and marched out, her heels clicking angrily on the pavement. Victoria followed, huffing about her blood pressure. David stayed for a second longer. He looked at me, his lips trembling. "Claire," he said. "I didn't know." "I know you didn't, Dad," I said, and for the first time I felt pity for him. But you didn't want to know. You chose the quiet over the truth. And now you have all the quiet you ever wanted. He lowered his head and followed them out. The gate clicked shut. I stood there for a moment, the wind catching the silk of my dress. I felt light. I felt as if 1,000 pounds of lead had been lifted from my chest. I walked back to Marcus. He took my hands, his thumbs grazing my knuckles. "You okay?" he whispered. "I've never been better," I said. We finished the vows. We exchanged the rings. And when the officiant pronounced us husband and wife, the cheer that went up from the garden wasn't just for a marriage. It was for liberation. As the sun began to set, casting long, golden shadows across the lawn, we sat down at a long farmhouse table. There were no folding chairs. There was no adult table versus kids table. There was just one table. And every single person there had been chosen. I looked at the empty space where my biological family had stood. It didn't feel like a hole. It felt like a clearing, a place where something new could finally grow. The weeks following, the wedding felt like the first deep breath after a lifetime of underwater swimming. The house Marcus and I shared was quiet, but it wasn't the heavy, suffocating silence of my childhood. It was the peaceful hum of a home being built on purpose. A month into our marriage, a letter arrived. It was from David. The envelope was thick, the handwriting shaky and uncharacteristically messy. I sat on our porch, the scent of the first autumn frost in the air, and read it. He told me he had left Linda. He told me that once, the truth was out in the open. The truth I had, whispered in that garden, he couldn't. Look at the perfect life they'd built without. Seeing the rot underneath. He apologized over and over for the years of silence. He said he was living in a small apartment near the coast and that he didn't expect me to forgive him, but he wanted me to know he finally understood what it felt like to be the one left without a seat. I didn't cry. I felt a strange, distant sadness for him. But the cord had been cut too cleanly to feel the sting. I folded the letter and put it in a drawer. I didn't write back. Some wounds are healed by apologies, but others are healed only by distance. Linda predictably went the other way. She sent a barrage of vitriolic emails, accusing me of ruining the family and poisoning David's mind. She claimed the DNA test was a lie, a fabrication I'd created to justify my betrayal. I didn't engage. I didn't defend myself. I simply hit delete. I had realized that you cannot reason with someone who is more committed to their delusions than to the truth. One rainy afternoon in November, 1 year to the day, since the phone call that changed everything, I was in my studio. I was working on a series of large-scale compositions, deep, rooted trees with branches that intertwined. Marcus came in, his boots clicking on the hardwood. He didn't say a word. He just walked up behind me and wrapped his arms around my waist. He rested his chin on my shoulder, watching the canvas. "You're glowing, Claire," he whispered. I leaned back into him. "It's the light in here. The rain makes everything look silver." "No," he said, turning me around to face him. He took my hand and placed it over my own stomach. "It's not the rain." I looked down at my hand, then back at his eyes. The realization hit me like a wave of warmth. I had been so busy living, so busy healing, that I hadn't even noticed the new life taking root. "Are you sure?" I breathed. "I saw the test on the counter," he grinned, his eyes shimmering. "And Margaret is already downstairs. I think she sensed it through the floorboards. She's already talking about where the crib will go." I laughed, a bright, clear sound that filled the studio. That evening, we walked over to the bungalow. Margaret and Richard were already in the kitchen. The smell of fresh bread and roasting chicken filled the air, the same scent that had saved me a year ago. Richard was at the table, sanding a small wooden rail. A piece for a crib. He didn't even wait for us to speak. He just looked up, his face breaking into a wide, weathered smile. "We're going to need a bigger table, Richard," Margaret said, wiping her hands on her yellow apron. "I'm already building the extension," he replied, his voice a low, steady rumble of joy. I sat down in my chair, my permanent, assigned, beloved chair. I looked at this family, this chosen, legal, intentional family. We were a carpenter, a cook, a painter, and a builder. We were a group of people who had found each other in the wreckage of other lives and decided to make something beautiful out of the pieces. The lesson I had learned wasn't about the cruelty of my mother or the weakness of my father. It was about the power of the word no. By saying no to the leftovers, I had said yes to the feast. By saying no to the secret, I had said yes to the light. I was no longer the low-maintenance daughter. I was a wife, a daughter of the heart, and soon a mother. As the snow began to fall outside, dusting the garden where I had stood my ground, I felt a profound sense of peace. The secret was out, the family was gone, and for the first time in my life, I was exactly where I was supposed to be. The high chair arrived on a Tuesday. It was a beautiful, sturdy piece of craftsmanship, hand-carved by Richard from the same cherry wood as my wedding frame. It didn't sit in a closet or wait in a garage. It was placed immediately at the head of the long farmhouse table, right between Marcus and me. I am 32 years old now. My daughter Alara is 6 months old. She has her father's messy dark hair and a laugh that sounds like the silver bell on the diner's door. When I look at her, I don't see a burden or a mistake. I see a person who will never, for a single second of her life, have to wonder if there is room for her. My life is quiet, but it is a full kind of quiet. My studio is now a place of color and light. My paintings are no longer just flowers. They are landscapes of the places where I found myself. The rain-slicked streets, the golden interior of the silver spoon, the garden where I finally said no. I haven't seen Linda or Victoria in years. I hear echoes of them sometimes. A social media post shared by a distant acquaintance. A mention of Victoria's perfect life. But they feel like characters in a book I read a long time ago. Their power over me didn't vanish because I was angry. It vanished because I became indifferent. You cannot haunt a house that has been torn down and rebuilt into a home. Last Thanksgiving, we didn't go anywhere. We stayed right here. The table was stretched to its full length. Margaret and Richard were there, of course. Marcus was at the stove, making the same cranberry sauce that tasted like rubies. Even David was there, quiet, tentative, but trying. He and Richard spent the afternoon talking about wood, grain, and the patience it takes to fix something that's been broken for a long time. I looked around the room, the air thick with the scent of sage and fresh bread. I realized that my mother-in-law's secret, the one she exposed, wasn't just about my DNA. It was the revelation that love is not a debt you owe to people who share your blood. Love is a choice you make every single day. It is the act of showing up, of building a bigger table, and of making sure that the people you claim never feel the cold. I walked over to the window. The city was gray and rainy, just like it had been 3 years ago. But the reflection in the glass was different. I wasn't the girl in the wet sweater, crying on the floor of a cold shower. I was a woman standing in the center of a life she had fought for. I've learned that boundaries aren't walls to keep people out. They are the gates that protect the beauty you've built inside. I've learned that your worth is not determined by how little space you can occupy, but by how much light you can bring into the rooms that deserve you. I sat down at the table. Alara reached out and grabbed my thumb, her tiny grip fierce and certain. I looked at Marcus, then at Margaret and Richard. "Everything is ready," Margaret said, placing the turkey in the center of the table. I looked at the 12 chairs, plus the high chair. There was plenty of room. There was more than enough. "Yes," I said, picking up my glass. "Everything is exactly as it should be." If you're watching this and you've been the scapegoat of your family, if you've been told you're too much or too sensitive, or always causing drama just because you dared to ask to be treated fairly, I want you to know something. It's not you. It never was. You deserve to be chosen. Not as a backup, not as a last resort, not as the acceptable sacrifice when someone else's comfort is at stake. Chosen first. Chosen fully. Chosen without conditions. Family isn't blood. Family isn't obligation. Family isn't people who share your DNA but treat you like a burden. Family is the people who show up. The people who see you crying alone and invite you to their table. The people who open their hearts and their homes and make you officially, permanently, undeniably theirs. I spent 29 years trying to earn love from people who were never going to give it. And then I spent 3 years learning what love actually looks like. If this story touched you, please take a moment to like, subscribe, and hit that notification bell. It helps more people find these stories when they need them most. I want to hear from you. Have you ever had to set boundaries with your own family? Share your experience in the comments. I read every single one. Tell me where you're watching from and what time it is there. I love knowing how far this story reaches. And if you want more stories like this, check the description. I've linked some of my favorites there. Until next time, remember, you deserve to be chosen.